Following a classic example of poor judgment, one young controller desperately tries to rectify his mistake, only to have his instructions fall on deaf ears. This is the complete story of Air California Flight 336, a story not only of poor judgment, but of hesitation, denial, poor procedural application, and a general gross lack of situational awareness all round, resulting in an accident which could have been so easily avoided. The afternoon of Tuesday, February 17th, 1981 was, to all intent and purpose, a Californian afternoon like any other. In downtown San Jose, clear skies overhead gave rise to a pleasant spring sunshine and temperatures in the low 70s. As many of the local workforce began to empty their offices for the day, the evening's commuter rush rapidly began to clog the local highways as tens of thousands of vehicles simultaneously took to the road. Somewhere within this melee were 105 passengers making their way to the local San Jose Mayanata International Airport, hoping to board that evening's Air California service south to Santa Ana, Los Angeles, a relatively short hop of no more than about 50 minutes or so. Scheduled for the trip that afternoon would be one of the company's Boeing 737-200 series aircraft, a twin-engine narrow-body short-range turbojet with a typical capacity of up to 130 passengers and a crew of 5. 53-year-old Captain Don Clark was to be rostered in command of the flight, a veteran of some 22,000 total flight hours, half of which had been obtained on the 737 type itself. His co-pilot and occupying the right-hand seat would be First Officer Noel Penderson, age 43. His total experience stretched to approximately 10,000 hours. However, being new to the 737, his experience on the type only extended to a very modest 28 hours. Having pushed from the gate at just after 16:30 local, about 15 minutes later Air Cal 336 lifted off into the setting sun and turned south towards Los Angeles. In the day, Air California was a US airline headquartered in Newport Beach, California, which had been founded in the mid-1960s as a Californian intrastate airline, the company choosing the neighbouring John Wayne Orange County Airport in Santa Ana as their home base. The airline was often perceived as the other Californian intrastate carrier, counterpart to the better-known Pacific Southwest Airlines, more commonly referred to as simply PSA. The two airlines had very different origins. PSA was the product of a highly competitive, lightly regulated earlier period in California intrastate airline history, while Air California, for its part, was born into a later, far more regulated environment. The Californian regulator explicitly aimed to ensure Air California's success by shielding it from PSA competition, in particular at Orange County Airport, from which PSA was excluded, with the airline being further protected by Orange County itself. From 1967 through 1980, Orange County insured Air California was one of only two mainline airlines to have access to the Orange County Airport, a lucrative duopoly that allowed the airline to prosper and quickly established itself as the dominant player at the airfield. Over the years, the airline would have a series of unconventional owners. During the period of 1970 to 74, it was under the control of one C. Arnold Smith, a San Diego power broker later convicted of fraud. From 74 to 81, it was controlled by Smith's former holding company, Westgate California Corporation, while Westgate was itself in an extended period of bankruptcy and run by a court-appointed trustee. Following the Federal Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, Air California expanded beyond its namesake state, flying as far east as Chicago and as far north as Seattle, Anchorage, and Vancouver, British Columbia. From 1981 to 87, in the aftermath of today's accident, the airline reinvented itself as AirCal, the airline then being controlled by two Californian real estate developers who, despite the turbulent nature of the industry at the time, made a success of the airline before selling it on to the US giant American Airlines in November 1986, subsequently merging into its new parent company and disappearing forever the following year. with both the departure and en route phases of the flight proceeding without incident. As 336 approached Santa Ana's John Wayne Orange County Airport and descended through 6,000 feet, Clark and Penderson completed the descent checklist, with the area controller shortly thereafter clearing the crew for a visual approach to runway 19 right. On duty in the tower that afternoon was 31-year-old Jonathan Slip. On initial contact, Slip had instructed the crew to keep it nice and square, indicating that they were number 3 overall following a slower beach bonanza between themselves and a Western Airlines Flight 383, another Boeing 737 already on finals to the same runway.
AirCal 336, keep it nice and square, sir. You're following traffic between you and that Boeing on final.
As the scenario developed, Slip began to realise that separation between 336 and the Bonanza may become problematic. As such, he instructed the Bonanza to make a left 360 and to report again once established on downwind.
Bonanza 12 Sierra, make one left 360 and report again on downwind.
Penderson informed the tower that they didn't have the Bonanza in sight, with Slip replying that having given him the 360, he was most probably going to end up behind them.
In Orange County, this is 336. We don't have our second traffic. Could you tell us where he is?
He's probably going to end up behind you. I've got him on a 360 on the downwind. Let's see how that works out.
Okay then, we cleared to turn in.
In response to Penderson's query, Slip cleared 336 to follow Western 383, reiterating once again his previous instruction for 336 to keep the turn to finals nice and square.
Yeah, you can turn inbound. Just keep it nice and square to finals.
At about this time, and indicative of just how busy Slip was becoming, his attention was suddenly diverted to a twin-engine Cessna who had just checked in on the frequency, also inbound to land at Santa Ana.
Orange County Tower, twin Cessna 888 Alpha Alpha, inbound for landing with the numbers.
Slip acknowledged their call and instructed them to report on a right-hand downwind for runway 19 right, while subsequently verifying the current altimeter setting and the wind as being from 150 degrees at 4 knots. With the frequency having all of a sudden gotten a whole lot busier, Western 383, possibly apprehensive that Slip had forgotten about them, quickly asked for clarification as to whether or not they had been cleared to land.
383 cleared to land?
To which Slip in the tower confirmed that they were. In fact, not only did he confirm that 383 was clear to land, but additionally a mere 8 seconds later at 17:33 and 11. He did the same for AirCal 336, who was by now number 2 in the sequence and following closely behind. With one 737 just about to touch down on runway 19 right, and another established on finals, Slip was once again distracted by yet another twin Cessna holding short of the parallel runway 19 left.
Orange County Tower, twin Cessna, 94 Mike, short of the left for takeoff.
Twin Cessna 94 Mike, no delay. Surface wind is calm. You're cleared, takeoff 19 left.
With the Cessna now rolling on 19 left, Slip turned his attention back to the traffic on 19 right. As Western 383 touched down, despite 336 having already received a landing clearance and being a mere 3 miles on final to runway 19 right, Slip nonetheless decided to line up a second AirCal 737, that being flight 931, in the hope of getting it airborne before 336's arrival.
Air California 931, let's do it. Taxi into position and hold. Be ready.
As Western 383 cleared the runway after landing, Slip noted that 931 was almost lined up, and in order to keep traffic moving, he immediately cleared it for takeoff, cautioning that 336 was now on a 1.5 mile final.
Western 383 ground at the end, 120.8. G'day, sir. No delay at the turn. Traffic to depart. AirCal 931. Traffic clearing at the end. Cleared for takeoff, sir. Boeing 737 1.5 mile final.
The crew of 931 acknowledged the clearance, reporting that they had the traffic in sight and were rolling.
In sight, we're rolling.
I know. Come on.
Shit. They shouldn't have cleared him out there.
In what was a case of incredibly poor timing, simultaneously twin Cessna 888 Alpha Alpha reported back on frequency, drawing on Slip's attention for the second time. Being forced to manage the distraction this caused, as he returned to focus on 336, it was immediately obvious to him that he had misjudged the separation between it and 931, which appeared to be only slowly starting its takeoff roll. As the gap between the two aircraft now reduced to no more than 3/4 of a mile, or just over 1,000 meters, Slip instructed 336 to discontinue the approach.
Okay, AirCal 336, go around. 336, go around. AirCal 931, you can just go ahead and hold. Got traffic on the go-around behind you. AirCal 931, just abort.
Incredibly, with Slip attempting to get 931 to stop its takeoff roll, on the flight deck of 336, Clark instructed Penderson to confirm with the tower whether they were cleared to land.
AirCal 336, we cleared to land?
Slip shot back for the second time.
AirCal 336, please go around, sir. Traffic is going to abort on departure.
From his vantage point in the tower, Slip couldn't believe his eyes. As 931 complied and came to a stop on the runway, 336, however, despite having a high pitch attitude, was nonetheless still descending. Without having time to react further, Slip watched in shock as 336 touched down hard to the right-hand side of the runway centerline. Ahead, 931 had slowed to almost pedestrian pace as the aircraft passed the beam taxiway Bravo, about halfway down the 5,700-foot-long runway. As 336 continued to roll out after touchdown, Slip watched in horror as its right-hand main landing gear drifted off the paved surface, with its right-hand wing dropping to the ground. The aircraft's fuselage was now sliding across the grass, while slowly rotating to the right as it did so. He watched as a flash of fire appeared from under the left wing, lasting for about 10 to 15 seconds, before eventually dying away. As the 737 finally came to a stop and the dust began to settle, relieved he observed the doors opening and the passengers begin to egress. Despite the fact that the aircraft was ultimately destroyed due to impact forces and post-impact fire, all on board had nonetheless gotten out safely, with the vast majority suffering only minor or no injuries at all. So what had gone wrong? Why had 336 failed to go round? And why, given the fact that it obviously hadn't, had the aircraft ended up a burning wreck off the side of the runway? John Wayne Orange County Airport is located some 5 miles south of Santa Ana, on the outskirts of the Los Angeles metropolitan area. It has 2 parallel runways orientated almost due north-south. The longer of the two, runway 19 right, 01 left, is 5,700 feet long and 150 feet wide. 19 left, 01 right, being the shorter of the two, is just under 2,900 foot long and 75 feet wide, with the thresholds of both being adjacent. The 2 runways are, however, located so close to each other that parallel simultaneous approaches are very much restricted. The control tower servicing the field is located some 750 feet west of runway 19 right, 01 left, at a distance of about 3,000 feet from the 19 right threshold. The year previous, in 1980, there were nearly 570,000 aircraft movements at the airport, making it the 4th busiest in the entire United States. Fortuitously for the NTSB investigation team was the fact that all significant players had survived to tell their stories. From the crew's perspective, Clark stated that they had been conducting a pretty routine visual approach to runway 19 right when handed over to Slip as the on-duty Orange County Tower Controller. He recalled that they had been sequence number 3 for the landing, behind another 737, that being Western 383, and a light general aviation Bonanza. Flying visually, and thus responsible for his own traffic separation, he remembered informing Slip that he didn't have the Bonanza in sight. Slip replied that he had instructed the Bonanza to perform a 360 on the downwind, and as such the sequence had been altered, allowing 336 to land behind the preceding 737, meaning that the Bonanza was now no longer a factor. With the Western 737 now on the ground, as they continued their approach, Clark recalled being somewhat surprised to hear the tower controller line up their company 931 ahead of their arrival. In an effort to maximise separation between the two aircraft, he recalled instructing Penderson to extend the aircraft's trailing edge flaps to their final flap 40 position, while simultaneously he pulled both thrust levers back to idle in order to lose whatever excess speed he was still carrying. He stated that as the gap between the two aircraft closed, he could see that the 737 on the runway ahead of him, although lined up, had still not commenced his takeoff roll. Seconds later, he recalled Slip in the tower instructing him to discontinue the approach and go-around. In response, he stated that he had advanced the thrust levers forward with the intention of applying the maximum power available. Hearing Slip repeat the go-around instruction, he said he had motioned Penderson to select the flaps to 15 and raise the gear per their standard go-around procedure, despite Clark's stated attempt to comply with Slip's instruction to discontinue the approach. With the aircraft's two Pratt & Whitney JT8D engines having been rotating at idle, even pushing the thrust levers all the way forward had not resulted in the instantaneous power increase which he now required. This wasn't any technical deficiency or defect, but rather a well understood and accepted performance characteristic of all turbojet or turbofan engines. Acceleration and thus corresponding power output from idle is not linear and proportional to thrust lever movement. Rather, there is a noticeable lag or delay before the eventual exponential increase in thrust is realised. To put this in context, what the investigation team subsequently established was that Clark had moved both thrust levers forward to maximum power approximately 9 seconds before impact. For the 2 seconds that immediately followed, power output from both engines increased only slightly. Then, 7 seconds before impact, both engines began to accelerate continuously and steadily until a comparatively high power output was achieved 3 seconds before impact on one engine and 1.5 seconds before impact on the other. Thus, from near idle to maximum power had taken nearly 6.5 to 7 seconds from the time the thrust levers were actually moved, which they deduced was pretty normal for this engine type. However, given the low altitude from which the go-around procedure had been initiated, this delay in power application would have serious consequences. Clark added that with the thrust levers having been advanced all the way forward, he had sensed no increase in RPM or corresponding increase in power output from either engine, so he claimed he had reached over and selected the landing gear lever back down in the expectation that the aircraft, despite his efforts to go around, was actually going to touch down on the runway. Moments later, this is exactly what happened. After the aircraft had touched down, he stated that he had deliberately attempted to steer it to the right of the centerline in an effort to avoid hitting their company 931, which by now had stopped on the runway. He said that he had closed the thrust levers and was completely taken by surprise when the landing gear suddenly collapsed. Penderson's deposition was, for the most part, consistent with Clark's. He stated that he had also heard 336 being instructed to go around, and then heard Slip repeat the instruction. He had raised the flaps to 15 degrees and observed Clark push the thrust levers forward. After checking for a positive rate of climb, he believed that he had selected the gear lever up. After that, he believed the aircraft had encountered turbulence and had begun to settle, subsequently striking the right-hand edge of the runway in a nose-up attitude. He observed Clark close both thrust levers, with the aircraft subsequently coming to a stop about 2,100 feet down the runway, having skidded for some time across the ground. He recalled that Clark had pulled the fire handles for both engines and executed the ground evacuation checklist. After this, both he and Clark had entered the passenger cabin to ensure all passengers and crew had exited the aircraft before they themselves left through the forward entry door. From the cabin crew's perspective, all agreed that the aircraft had touched down, bounced, and then touched down a second time a lot harder than the first. They had collectively felt a sensation as if they were going around, but with far less thrust than one would have expected normally. The senior flight attendant stated that she felt the aircraft waver after the second touchdown, as if it was on one wheel, with the flight attendant sitting up front next to her stating that she felt that the aircraft had dipped to the left after touchdown. Passengers interviewed likewise stated that they felt two distinct touchdowns, followed by what many described as a mechanical moving noise, with the next sensation being that of the aircraft sliding hard. Ultimately, 4 of these passengers would sustain serious injuries, with a further 29 reporting minor ones. According to the air traffic control transcript, Slip had been handling a total of 5 other aircraft in the pattern at the time of the accident. This volume of traffic, although not uncommon, being a mix of both light general aviation and jet transports, did require careful separation given the respective performance capabilities of each respective grouping. In order to achieve this, strict guidelines were in place to ensure that this same separation was implemented in a safe and consistent manner. For example, with regard to arriving and departing traffic using the same runway, separation between the two had to be such so as to ensure that the landing aircraft did not cross the runway threshold until the departing aircraft had crossed the far threshold at the departure end of the runway. Or alternatively, in the case of two Category 3 aircraft, as was the case between the arrival of 336 and the departure of 931, a physical separation of 6,000 feet could be maintained between both. In other words, Slip was at liberty to issue 336 with a landing clearance in advance of 931's departure, provided that he could maintain a minimum of 6,000 feet or just over a mile between the two, given that they were both 737s, and that the landing traffic had been informed of the departure in progress. On the evening in question, AirCal 336 had been 1 3/4 miles, or the equivalent of 2.8 kilometres from the threshold of 19 right, when Slip had cleared 931 for takeoff. In his post-accident deposition, he had stated that he believed that a jet transport on a 1.5 final, or 2.4 kilometres, with departing traffic on the runway, would have had more than adequate separation, given the rules in place at the time. This was based on the anticipation that the departing traffic would expedite their takeoff without delay, and that the arriving traffic would fly a stabilised, constant final approach speed. At 17:33 and 33 seconds, Slip cleared 931 to line up and be ready, with the crew of 931 acknowledging the clearance. Nearly 12 seconds later, 931 began an initial 15-degree turn to the right before making a 105-degree turn to the left, in order to line up with the centre line of runway 19 right. Having received their takeoff clearance, application of takeoff power was finally recorded at 17:34 and 10 seconds, a full 37 seconds after they had been cleared to enter the runway. Undoubtedly, 931's tardy lineup had aggravated the situation, and in combination with how Clark and 336 was conducting his approach, separation between the two was now inevitably going to become an issue. Clark, for his part, wasn't flying a stabilised approach, nor had he kept it nice and square as he'd been requested to do. He had actually flown most of the approach at a speed of between 140 and 160 knots, whereas the correct bug speed had been a mere 119. In other words, he was way fast. This, combined with a wide sweeping turn to finals, had decreased the separation between himself and 931, to the point that the necessity for a go-around was all but inevitable. To compound matters still further, Clark, once recognising this reduced separation, had reduced power on both engines to idle in an effort to slow his aircraft as much as possible, inadvertently creating a situation whereby immediate thrust response, if subsequently required, would be diminished. Having cleared 931 for takeoff, the unfortunate timing of twin Cessna 888 Alpha Alpha's radio transmission to the tower, with an unexpected position in the traffic pattern, momentarily diverted Slip's attention. Having given this aircraft amended traffic instructions, he looked back to make a final check on situation between 336 and 931, only to see that 931 had made relatively little progress with regards getting airborne. Realising that if the situation were allowed to continue, he would not have the mandated minimum separation between the two, he firstly instructed 336 twice to go around, before instructing 931 to abort their takeoff. What the cockpit voice recorder subsequently showed was that, contrary to what had been said in his post-accident deposition, Clark had not in fact responded when 336 was initially told to go around at an altitude of 250 feet, approximately 3/4 of a mile or 1.2 kilometres from the end of the runway. He had instead, a full 8 seconds after the initial go-around instruction having been issued, asked Penderson to query the tower controller as to whether they could land. This the investigation team clearly interpreted as a commitment on Clark's part to continue with the approach irrespective of Slip's instruction. Had the throttles been advanced immediately, it would have taken between 6 and 8 seconds for the engines to have spooled up from idle to go-around power, while all the time the aircraft would have continued to descend at a rate of approximately 1,000 feet per minute, or 17 feet per second, resulting in a further loss of about 100 to 130 feet in total. This outcome would have left things tight but manageable, with a successful go-around ultimately having been achieved. However, the truth was that Clark had not responded to Slip's instruction to go around for a full 12 seconds, not until the instruction had been issued for the second time. On receiving this second instruction to go around, Clark this time did advance the thrust levers and called for the landing gear to be selected up. This sequence of actions was contrary to the published go-around procedure for the 737 type, which calls for power application and simultaneous rotation to the go-around attitude of 15 degrees nose up, as being the first requirement, followed by flap reselection from the landing configuration to 15 degrees, and then, finally, with confirmation of a positive rate of climb, retraction of the landing gear. Penderson had apparently adhered to the correct procedure regardless, with his first act not being retraction of the gear as requested, but rather the movement of the flap lever from the 40 position to the 15 degree setting. Without the coordinated rotation to the correct go-around attitude, however, this act in itself would only have resulted in reduced lift being produced by the wing, and an actual increase in the aircraft's rate of descent. The cockpit voice recorder indicated that almost simultaneously Clark called again for the gear to be retracted, with an audible click sound in the background suggesting that Penderson had complied, at approximately 17:34 and 31 seconds. Rubber tire marks positively indicated that the main landing gear were extended as 336 initially touched down on runway 19 right. However, the distance between these marks progressively reduced as the aircraft continued down the runway, indicative of the fact that the gear was actually in the process of retracting during the accident sequence. Indeed, all three gear were found to be retracted when the aircraft came to rest. In summary, the NTSB came to the conclusion that Clark's handling of the 737 in the minimum separation environment which existed at the time was the ultimate deciding factor in the accident. They believed that the first indication to the tower controller of deteriorating separation came as he returned his attention to Flight 336 and 931 after being distracted by the radio call from the twin Cessna entering the traffic pattern. With the tower controller being located about a mile or so from the approach end of runway 19 right, initial movement of departing traffic can be somewhat difficult to detect, with such aircraft moving almost directly towards the tower. That said, at 17:34 and 13 seconds, Slip, correctly assessing the developing situation, had instructed 336 to discontinue their approach and to go around. Clark, however, on hearing the instruction, had consciously failed to do so. Instead, a full 8 seconds later, incredibly, he had instructed Penderson in the right-hand seat to query whether they were still cleared to land. As 336 continued its approach, noting that 931 was finally on the move, Slip instructed it to abandon its takeoff, while immediately repeating his previous instruction to Clark to discontinue his approach. In response, only then at 17:34 and 25 seconds, a full 12 seconds after the initial instruction to go around, had Clark reacted. But the reality was he had delayed too long. In those few critical seconds, valuable time and altitude had been lost, and compounded by poor procedural application, Air California 336 had touched down on runway 19 right, with the landing gear still in the process of retracting. 336 had not flown a square pattern as it had been directed to, and in so doing had made the separation issue unnecessarily challenging. The latter part of the approach had not been stabilised, with the 737 being flown about 20 to 30 knots faster than it should have been, and when the instruction had come to discontinue the approach, this instruction had not been complied with in an expeditious and efficient manner. Thus, the final report concluded that Clark's failure to immediately initiate the go-around when instructed to do so, and his subsequent eventual failure to execute the specified go-around procedure correctly, had resulted in the aircraft contacting the ground with the landing gear in transit to the retracted position, causing the accident to happen. And so closes the chapter of Air California 336, but for one significant outstanding issue. With final publication of the accident report, it became clear that not all members of the investigation team had agreed with its ultimate conclusion. Of note, there was the dissenting comments of one Francis H. McAdams, whose statement read as follows.
I do not agree with the conclusion of the board that air traffic control's management of the traffic pattern was in accordance with current directives. The air traffic controller's manual states that an arriving aircraft shall not cross the landing threshold until the departing aircraft has crossed the runway end or the two aircraft are separated by at least 6,000 feet. In this case, the controller should have anticipated that the separation between the two aircraft would have been substantially less than the 6,000 feet required, with Air California 336 reaching the threshold of the runway, while the departing aircraft had not yet cleared the opposite end. The initial error of judgment was the controller's action in clearing Air California Flight 931 into position at 17:33 and 33 seconds, and subsequently clearing 931 for takeoff at 17:33 and 52 seconds. The second error in judgment was delaying the go-around directive to Flight 336 until 17:34 and 13 seconds, since at that time, the aircraft were separated by only about 3,600 feet, or to put it another way, 2,400 feet less than the required minimum distance. At the time that 931 was cleared for takeoff, at 17:33 and 52 seconds, the two aircraft were separated by approximately 2,900 feet. The readout of the flight data recorder indicated that 336 flew the majority of the final approach at an airspeed of between 140 to 160 knots. Even if the controller assumed that 336 had been maintaining an airspeed of VREF, that being 120 knots, or the equivalent of 2.3 miles per minute, he should have known that it would be over the threshold in approximately 38 seconds, or at 17:34 and 30 seconds local. Since 931 had begun its takeoff roll at 17:34 and 2 seconds, it would have still been on the runway, or just starting to rotate at 17:34 and 30 seconds, at a point approximately 3,200 feet from the threshold. Therefore, when 336 was over the threshold, the two aircraft would have been separated by no more than about 3,200 feet, and the controller should have anticipated that the separation would be substantially less than the distance required. However, in fact, 931 aborted at 17:34 and 27 seconds, or 25 seconds after starting its takeoff roll, and 1,774 feet down the runway. Therefore, when 336 would have crossed the threshold, the two aircraft would have been separated by only 2,395 feet, and 931 would still have been on the runway. The separation between the two aircraft becomes substantially less if we use a speed of 150 knots, the average of the recorded approach speed. At this speed, the aircraft would have been traveling at 176 miles per hour, 2.9 miles per minute, or the equivalent of 253 feet per second, resulting in a separation between the two aircraft at 17:34 and 13 seconds, the time at which the go-around instruction was issued, of just 2,587 feet. Under these circumstances, 336 would have been over the threshold of 19 right at 17:34 and 23 seconds, while 931 would have been still on the runway and 4 seconds from aborting its takeoff roll. In such a case, the separation between the two would have been reduced to just 1,470 feet. The captain of Flight 931 transmitted on the tower frequency that they were rolling at 17:33 and 57 seconds local, this being considered the most accurate account of when the aircraft actually started to move. The tower controller's evidence, however, revealed that as this call was made, the 737 wasn't actually lined up on the runway at all, but was instead just aligning itself with the center line. Allowing, say, 5 seconds to correctly align with the runway, 931's takeoff roll would thus more likely have actually commenced at about 17:34 and 2 seconds, a full 10 seconds or so after its takeoff clearance had been issued. Given the fact that on line-up 931 had to make a 90-degree turn in order to align with the runway centerline, 10 seconds in itself wasn't an unreasonable amount of time, but in truth, the controller hadn't fully taken this into consideration, with the requirement of the turn making it impossible for the jet to commence its takeoff roll immediately, as had been the controller's expectation. It is stated by the majority of signatories to the final report that the crew of Flight 931 aggravated the situation by delaying their takeoff by 37 seconds in total. With respect, I do not agree. The delay was in fact about 30 seconds, which given the circumstances I do not believe was unreasonable. Significantly, the body of the report does not contain any deposition from the crew of Air California Flight 931, so it is impossible to determine their version of the timing and sequence of events. More importantly, however, is the fact that when the controller cleared 931 into position, he did not instruct the crew to expedite. On the contrary, his exact words were merely taxi into position and hold, informing the crew that they were to be ready. Furthermore, having finally issued 931 with its takeoff clearance, with the aircraft still perpendicular to the runway centerline, yet again there was no recorded instruction on his part to have the crew expedite the lineup maneuver. Once 931 had been cleared onto the runway, the crew would have had every expectation that they would be protected from arriving traffic until completion of their takeoff roll. This, however, was not to be the case. With regard the progress of Flight 336, after it had turned finals, at no time did the controller request Clark to reduce his aircraft's speed to the minimum possible, which was certainly an option given the circumstances. I realize that much of the above is based on computations that are only estimates, and further, that controllers do not control aircraft with a slide rule. However, in this instance, the controller, based upon training and experience, should have realized at some point that the situation would develop to a point where the two aircraft would be separated by substantially less than the required and safe minimum distance. Therefore, in my opinion, the controller should have issued Flight 336 with an instruction to discontinue his approach, much earlier than he did, or alternatively, should not have cleared 931 into position at all, until after 336 had successfully landed. Although I agree that Clark did indeed delay initiation of the go-around maneuver, I nonetheless firmly believe that the controller, for his part, waited too long to issue the necessary instruction, given the reducing separation. Aborting the approach at a height below 250 feet can be accomplished safely, but not without some additional risk, as the aircraft's own inertia will result in a further descent, of perhaps as much as 130 feet, while the maneuver is being executed.
With all the necessary facts now disclosed, you decide. Were McAdams' comments justified, or was it a case that Clark was to shoulder all the blame, as was the NTSB's assertion? This is the complete story of Air California Flight 336, an education in poor judgment made worse by one man's hesitation and the adverse effect of basic physics.